Thank you all for coming to week 4 of our faith study. So for those of you who've been here for the first 3 weeks, you know that we've been exploring some pretty big topics. In week 1, we looked at how the church insists upon the fact that everyone is endowed with an infinite dignity. And we talked about how that word is a bit controversial, right? The word infinite dignity, because how can a finite entity, a human person, be endowed with an infinite dignity? So we talked about that in week 1. And interestingly, I'm pretty sure that the phrase infinite dignity just appeared in Pope Leo's new document that we were talking about in some of the previous weeks. In week 2, for those who were here, we looked at the idea of the universal destination of goods, which is the idea that the goods of the earth, the things of the earth, the resources of the earth are meant for everyone and therefore have to be shared equitably among everyone. And we talked about the kind of radical idea on the church's view that one who appropriates more of the goods of the earth than they're entitled to, who amasses more than their fair share, is, on the logic of the fathers and the logic of the church, stealing in a certain sense. And in week 3, we looked at how God has a special preferential love for the poor, and how we too should pay attention to the poor and the marginalized, on those on the peripheries, to use Pope Francis's language. Now, our topic today touches upon all of these things, but it's a bit obscure. This will probably be our most abstract session, our most academic session. But I hope that what we talk about today can provide at least a bit of a framework that ties everything together that we've talked about. And the concept that we're going to talk about today is something called integral human development, or integral human development, as it's pronounced in Canada, I think. But I learned this stuff in the States, so I use the word integral human development. Integral human development is a bit of an enigmatic phrase. It's kind of mysterious. It's not immediately clear what it refers to, although we talked about terminology and how some of the terminology that appears in Catholic social teaching is a bit hard to understand, like preferential option for the poor, and how that's a terminological word salad, but it means something concrete. Integral human development is kind of like that. It's an enigmatic phrase that keeps popping up in major papal documents, but that lots of people just kind of skim over or overlook. So just to kind of survey some of the documents that it shows up in, and this is by no means exhaustive. In an encyclical, which is a papal letter, a letter the Pope writes, called Redemptoris Missio, in 1990, Pope John Paul II said, "A commitment to peace, justice, human rights, and human promotion is also a witness to the gospel when it is a sign of concern for persons and is directed toward integral human development." So that's Pope John Paul II in 1990. Later, 19 years later, in 2009, right after the global financial crisis, in Pope Benedict's social encyclical, Caritas in Veritate, he said, "The whole church, in all her being and acting, when she proclaims, when she celebrates, when she performs works of charity, is engaged in promoting integral human development." And more recently, Fratelli Tutti by Pope Francis in 2020, we have the line, "If we want true integral human development for all, we must work tirelessly to avoid war between nations and peoples." So again, this is a phrase that keeps popping up, but that it's easy to overlook, because again, what does this mean? It's 3 words, what does it mean? But interestingly, the phrase has been adopted quite widely among institutional channels. So the Vatican, for instance, now has a dicastery, which is like a top-level department. So you might have heard of the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. It used to be called the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. That's the department that deals with doctrine. You might have heard of the Dicastery for Bishops, previously the Congregation for Bishops, which is the body that figure out which bishops to put where. We now have a dicastery for promoting integral human development. And according to its statutes, the point of this dicastery is to express the Holy See's concern for issues of justice and peace, including those related to migration, health, charitable works, and care of creation. And what's interesting about that is how all-encompassing the range is, right? The Dicastery for Integral Human Development has responsibility. Hey, Dave, how's it going? Good to see you. The Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development, I think there are some seats. We could grab a... Yeah. the responsibility for this dicastery is wide-ranging. It spans questions of justice and peace, immigration, environmentalism. So it's huge, right? Like, it touches upon all these aspects of human development, social progress, all these kinds of things. And in a way, it ties together all the things that we've talked about in the 3 previous weeks of our study. And kind of on a more personal note, my connection with this concept, and the reason I care about this, because you usually don't talk about this concept in a course on, or a faith study on Catholic social teaching. My connection is that I did a master's degree at a Catholic institution called Notre Dame. I did a bachelor's degree in theology from the same institution. But my master's degree was related to public policy, and one of its guiding principles was integral human development. So we talked a lot about this idea of integral human development. So it's a phrase that keeps appearing in Catholic charitable, non-governmental, non-profit circles. But what does it mean? To answer this question, I want to go back and take a look at a document from 1967, a papal encyclical called Populorum Progressio, which is Latin for the development of peoples. And we've looked at this document before. You may remember a couple of weeks ago, sorry, this is going to take a while, but you may remember a couple of weeks ago we looked at this quote, this quite radical quote from Populorum Progressio, where Pope Paul VI said, "The fathers of the church laid down the duty of the rich toward the poor in no uncertain terms. As St. Ambrose put it, you are not making a gift of what is yours to the poor man, but you are giving him back what is his. You have been appropriating things that are meant to be for the common use of everyone. The earth belongs to everyone, not to the rich. These words indicate that the right to private property is not absolute and unconditional. No one may appropriate surplus goods solely for his own private use when others lack the bare necessities of life. The right of private property may never be exercised to the detriment of the common good." So we looked at that a couple of weeks ago when we talked about the universal destination of goods. But this, it's quite a visionary document. There was much more in it. And this is the first document where we get a sense of what integral human development is. So in that very same document, Pope Paul VI, the Pope who famously closed the Second Vatican Council, said this: "The development we speak of here cannot be restricted to economic growth alone. To be authentic, it must be well-rounded. It must foster the development of each man and of the whole man. As an eminent specialist on this question has rightly said, we cannot allow economics to be separated from human realities, nor development from the civilization in which it takes place. What counts for us is man, each individual man, each human group, and humanity as a whole." And obviously, when the Pope says man here, it's an inclusive use of the word man. It's famous gendered language of the popes, but it means humanity, right? This is the main idea behind integral human development. The phrase actually doesn't appear, but this is what's at the origin of it. The development of what the Pope calls each man and the whole man is the basic concept of this enigmatic phrase of integral human development. And as a former professor of mine, Clemens Sedmak, put it, integral human development is the development of the whole person and the development of each person. And these are two sides of the same coin. On the one hand, each human being needs to develop integrally, in her integrity, right? And if you've been around Catholic educational circles, you're probably familiar with some of this language, right? Like a lot of our Catholic elementary and high schools will talk about something like, we educate the whole person, the mind, the body, and the spirit, and they'll talk about how PE is involved in that, right? That's the whole idea, right? The whole person, including the physical dimension, including fitness, the whole person is involved in the act of educating the person in the Catholic worldview. So that's one side of the coin, right? On the one hand, on this hand, each human being needs to develop integrally, but on the other, all people, each human group and humanity as a whole, needs to be taken into account. Nobody, in the famous words of Pope Francis, is left out or left over. And what Pope Paul VI was trying to correct here was an impulse, which was quite common in the 60s and not uncommon today, that says that the most important dimension of development is economic. The primary dimension of development is economic, right? I mean, obviously, like, this is in the context of international development, and there was a tendency, there still is a tendency, to equate development with economic development, right? A country progresses insofar as its GDP increases. And even in our own society, I think it's clear that the values of our market economy have taught us to think of flourishing or making it in primarily monetary and economic terms, right? You've made it if you have a good job. You've made it if you manage to secure a lot of assets in an investment account, or perhaps you've made it if, after a very long amount of time and a lot of effort, you finally managed to get onto the Vancouver property ladder by leveraging yourself to the hilt. So I think we have this idea, right? What counts as money, what counts as resources, what counts as material possessions. But what the church is saying is that there's more to development, much more than just economic development, that other things count too, especially things that same professor, Clemens Sedmak, called the non-productive aspects of human life, the non-productive aspects of human life. And for the church, obviously, among those non-productive aspects of human life, spiritual development is really important, obviously. I mean, I've used the word non-productive loosely. It's very productive on a certain reading. But the church obviously places a lot of value on spiritual development, religious development, moral development. But what's surprising and what is perhaps less known is that the church actually places a lot of value on cultural development too. So, Gaudium et Spes, which is a document of the Second Vatican Council, a constitution, one of the 4 constitutions of the Second Vatican Council, talked about culture and said it is necessary to provide all with a sufficient quantity of cultural benefits, especially of those which constitute the so-called fundamental culture, lest very many be prevented from cooperating in the promotion of the common good. Everything must be done to make everyone conscious of the right to culture and the duty he has of developing himself culturally and of helping others. So, Constitution from Vatican II, talking about our right to culture. So, how does this express itself concretely? The same document talks about the value of literature, talks about the value of art. It comments positively on reductions in the number of hours that you have to work, the number of working hours, so that people can relax and, quote, fortify the health of soul and body through spontaneous study and activity. It's pretty optimistic to think that people would spend their recreational time studying, but maybe, I don't know. This is before TikTok, so. The same document, Vatican II's Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, Gaudium et Spes, talks about the value of sport, which helps to preserve equilibrium of spirit even in the community. The document says it actually, and this is dear to my heart, it has positive things to say about tourism, which, quote, refines man's character and enriches him with understanding of others, close quote. So it has many things to say, many positive things to say about all of these aspects of life that we can consider frivolous, right? Literature, art. I don't know if it speaks about poetry directly, but obviously that's kind of included in this whole circle of things it's talking about. Tourism, sport, all of these things are included in this section where the council talks about a right to culture, a right to culture. And of course the church warns against superficial pleasures, but where these things help us to live more authentically, where they help us to become more human, where they move us toward truth and beauty and goodness, they have a role to play in lives that are lived well, in lives that are lived authentically. And I think that what we're starting to see here is that when the church speaks about the human person, it looks at the human person in all of her dimensions, right? The church thinks that people have the right to full, rich, and meaningful lives, right? We may be reminded of that phrase of Jesus's, right? I have come that they might have life and have it to the full. And so part of that is enjoying some of these non-productive aspects of life. And the church insists that, kind of on the faith side, that coming to faith does nothing to diminish this fullness and abundance of life, but actually increases it, right? I'm reminded of something that Pope Benedict said in his inaugural homily as Pope. If we let Christ into our lives, we lose nothing, nothing, absolutely nothing, of what makes life free, beautiful, and great. If we let Christ into our lives, we lose nothing, absolutely nothing of what makes life free, beautiful, and great. What else? So the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church talks about many other things, right, that are necessary for the common good, including the commitment to peace, the organization of the state's power, the sound juridical system, the protection of the environment, and the provision of essential services to all, including food, housing, work, education, and access to culture, transportation, basic health care, and freedom of communication and expression, and the protection of religious freedom. And again, this isn't an exhaustive list, right? Like, it's huge, right? Like, we can't list all the dimensions of life that are important on the church's view. But I think what we're starting to see is that the church's view of the human person is really integral, right? It's really, I mean, to use a word, it's really Catholic. It embraces a universality. It embraces all these dimensions of who we are. And remember, the church insists that this applies to each person and all persons. Everyone on the church's view ought to get the chance to develop all of the dimensions of themselves. Nobody is left out, not a single person. We're not just economic beings, we're not just cultural beings, we're not just beings who practice the contemplative or devotional parts of religion, we're everything, and everyone has all of these dimensions that they ought to have the right to pursue. And that is the positive vision of human development that the church espouses. And I know that was a lot, and I know that this has been the most academic and most abstract of the 4 sessions we've had. But for those of you who have been here previous weeks, you know the kind of format. We pause in the middle and we discuss. And so maybe for now, as we go into our discussion, I will share my favorite description of integral human development, which comes from a historian of religion named R. Scott Appleby, who I think, if I did it right, yes, that's R. Scott Appleby, and also an unknown person. So R. Scott Appleby, who was a professor of mine, said, the term integral human development is of Catholic provenance, but the ideas and values underlying it find echo in many other religious, philosophical, and wisdom traditions. At its core is the conviction that the dignity of the human person is expressed in work and economic activity, that's important, but also in cultural richness, artistic creativity, religious belonging, and spiritual practice. Most profoundly, human dignity is expressed in our relationships with and obligations to family, community, and ultimately to all of humanity. And we will talk about that relational aspect after the break. But for now, I'll let you all absorb that. I don't know how much food we have. We don't have a lot, but grab a snack if you can. We'll reconvene in maybe 10 minutes, and we'll talk about some of these ideas. And yeah, then we'll go from there. So let's take a break for 10 minutes and come back after that for our discussion. So thank you. Let's just do a quick 10 minutes of wrap up, just to, traditionally, I've used this 10 minutes of wrap up to kind of present the church's view on the question that we've discussed, but we kind of deviated a lot from this question. But I will start with it. So on this economics question, I just wanted to share an interesting thought from the church's social tradition that kind of like many of you were saying, there can be such a thing as too much economic development. So we have this interesting quote from John Paul II in an encyclical on solidarity called Sollicitudo Rei Socialis, which we quoted before. And John Paul II says this: side by side with the miseries of underdevelopment, themselves unacceptable, we find ourselves up against a form of superdevelopment equally inadmissible. Because like the former, it is contrary to what is good and to true happiness. This superdevelopment, which consists in an excessive availability of every kind of material good for the benefit of certain social groups, easily makes people slaves of possession and of immediate gratification, with no other horizon than the multiplication or continual replacement of the things already owned with others still better. This is the so-called civilization of consumption or consumerism, which involves so much throwing away and waste. So here very clearly in this encyclical from John Paul II, and repeated in the tradition in subsequent encyclicals, we have an indication from the Church that economic development is far from the be-all and end-all of human development. That there are other things, right, like those non-productive aspects of human life that matter too, and that actually, as many of you pointed out, too much economic development can actually be spiritually detrimental, but not just spiritually detrimental to your flourishing as a whole person, right? Because you can imagine the situation of someone who is so focused on economic gains that they ignore all the other things that make life beautiful. So, John Paul II criticizing an excessive availability of every kind of material good, super development, and this culture of overconsumption and waste. But I think to close, I want to bring this all together by adding one final thing. Integral human development and Catholic social teaching more broadly is absolutely insistent on the fact that human beings are inherently relational. Human beings are not unencumbered selves, to use the language that Professor Clement said that. We're not unencumbered selves. We're not essentially independent agents going about life alone. The idea behind integral human development, the whole person and all people, is that the person, the individual, is inherently related to all other people. That we are intrinsically relational by our very nature. And so there's this wonderful quote from Pope Benedict II encyclical, Spe Salvi on Hope, where he says this: "No man is an island entire of itself. Our lives are involved with one another through innumerable interactions. They are linked together. No one lives alone, no one sins alone, no one is saved alone. The lives of others continually spill over into mine, in what I think, say, do, and achieve. And conversely, my life spills over into that of others for better and for worse." So, over these past 4 weeks, as we've talked about Catholic social teaching, I think that we can see that there is a basic belief in the Church's view that by the very fact of our being human, we're connected with every other person. That when a migrant suffers, as we talked about in week 1, that matters to us. That when we accumulate excess wealth, there's an obligation that we have towards those who have nothing. That when we encounter a poor person or someone on the margins, it isn't just a phenomenon that we have nothing to do with, because the lives of others continually spill over into mine. The very idea of integral human development, the very idea of Catholic social teaching, presumes that to develop authentically means to be concerned for all people. As we said, it's about the development of the whole person, all persons, and the Church will insist that you cannot be a whole person. You cannot develop the fullness of yourself unless you are concerned for all persons. And that, I think, is one of the main takeaways, just throwing it back to the very basics of the gospel, the very basics of the entire Jewish and Christian tradition, that we are only fully ourselves when the things that affect the lives of our sisters and brothers affect us too. And that, I think, is the summary of Catholic social teaching, and in a way, a summary of the gospel. And I want to thank you for being here over the past 4 weeks. It's been wonderful to talk about Catholic social teaching with all of you, and I hope you've learned something. But yeah, this is the end of our faith study on Catholic social teaching, so thank you for coming, and I hope you found it interesting, so thank you.